I'm Lisa Carter, 35, quiet, civilian clothes, sitting in the second row at my younger brother's military graduation, watching my family beam with pride while pretending I'm invisible. It wasn't always like this, but once you're labeled the disgrace of the family, the truth doesn't seem to matter anymore. My brother Ethan stood tall on the stage in his crisp dress uniform, our father's old combat badge pinned proudly to his chest. The crowd clapped as the speaker listed each cadet's accomplishments, and around me, relatives smiled, whispered, wiped tears. No one looked at me, and honestly, I was fine with that. Or at least, I had convinced myself I was. You see, years ago, I was the first in our family to join the military. I blazed the trail. I had the same dreams Ethan now wore on his sleeve, and I wore the same boots. Until everything changed. Until my name became the family's secret shame. Until I disappeared from their proud stories. But what happened at that graduation, when the general looked at me and stopped the entire room? Well, let's just say, that day rewrote everything. We'll get there. But to understand what happened, you need to know how I got erased. I was born into a family that breathed discipline, rules, duty, uniforms. My father served 22 years in the Army, retired as a decorated major. My grandfather, Air Force. My uncle, Navy. It was expected. For boys, it was a rite of passage. For girls, support from the sidelines, polite clapping, perfect hair, bake sales, maybe marry someone with medals. I never fit in that outline. At age 10, I memorized Morse code for fun. At 12, I was running drills in the backyard while my cousins played volleyball. When I told my father I wanted to attend a military academy, he stared at me for so long I thought he hadn't heard me. Finally, he sighed. "You're chasing something you don't understand, Lisa. It'll break you. And then we'll have to pick up the pieces." I joined anyway. At 17, I left home with a duffel bag, a scholarship, and enough ambition to outshine every doubt in my family's eyes. The first year was hell, but I survived it, then thrived in it. I rose through ranks, outpaced peers, gained the attention of my commanders. Strategy, leadership, endurance. I was made for it. My mother sent short, clipped letters. My father stopped calling altogether. When I was selected for a sensitive intelligence training program during my third year, I called home. Dad answered. I told him the news, voice bright with hope. He replied flatly, "Are you still running from something or just trying to prove us wrong?" I didn't call again for a long time. Then, during a mission overseas, something happened. And I can't tell you all of it. Much of it's still buried in classified reports. But I made a choice that ended my career. Or rather, it ended how people saw my career. The operation failed. Not because of my decision, but I was the easiest name to blame. There was an internal review, a political mess, and eventually, a discharge that came with silence and shame. My family didn't ask for details. They just decided the version they preferred. That I had cracked under pressure. That I had embarrassed them. From that day forward, I became the disappointment. They told everyone I had been dishonorably discharged, that I never should have joined, that I was emotional, unfit, unstable, and I let them believe it. Because trying to explain the truth to people who have already stopped listening hurts more than silence. I moved to another city, started over, quietly built a life. Still in service, just not in a way they would understand. I worked in private defense strategy, discreet, vital, hidden behind layers of confidentiality. My contributions saved lives, but you wouldn't find my name on a medal. And maybe that was the price I had to pay. So when Ethan got into the academy, my family celebrated as if he'd broken some invisible curse. "This is what we hoped Lisa would become," my father once said during a holiday dinner. "She tried, but she wasn't cut out for it." I said nothing, just passed the mashed potatoes and smiled. And now, here I was, years later, in a stuffy hall filled with the sounds of success and legacy. sitting quietly as the real Carter child stepped forward to receive his honors. I was just a shadow in the corner. Until the general walked in, until he looked my way, until recognition flashed across his face like a thunderclap. He paused, then started walking toward me. And in that moment, I knew this story wasn't over. The moment the general saw me, everything slowed. He had just stepped up to the podium, a composed man in full regalia, flanked by aides and flaring medals. His eyes scanned the crowd with the familiarity of someone used to being seen, not necessarily to seeing anyone else, until they landed on me. At first, I thought it was coincidence, a glance, a flicker. But then his face changed, subtle, but undeniable. Recognition. His brow lifted just slightly, then his posture stiffened. Then, he stepped away from the podium. At first, I thought maybe he was headed toward someone behind me. Maybe an aide. Maybe a misstep. Anything to explain why the commanding general of the entire division was now walking straight toward the second row of folding chairs where I sat. My mother, seated beside me, didn't notice. She was fussing with a ribbon on Ethan's ceremonial folder. My father, on the other side, leaned forward to snap a photo. But my pulse was loud in my ears, my hands suddenly clammy in my lap. Then he stopped, right in front of me. He extended his hand, firm, purposeful, public. "Captain Carter," he said, voice low but unmistakable. "Is it really you?" The entire row turned toward me. Conversations behind us froze. A few people in the rows ahead glanced back, sensing the shift in air. I stood up automatically. Old instincts. Even though I hadn't worn the uniform in years, the habits never leave you. My posture straightened. Chin up. "Yes, sir," I replied, my voice even. "It's me." He took my hand in both of his. "I can't believe this. We thought—" He stopped himself, his eyes narrowing. "We thought you were gone." I nodded quietly. I was, sort of. There was a flicker of emotion in his expression, something between awe and regret. He looked me over again as if verifying that I was real. Then, with no warning, he stepped back, squared his shoulders, and saluted me. The sound in the room, quiet murmurs, shuffling papers, hushed applause, vanished. Every eye turned. My father turned. My mother froze, the ribbon in her hand dropping to the floor. Even Ethan, seated on the stage, leaned forward, frowning in confusion. The general's voice rang out, clear, sharp, respectful. "It is an honor to see you again, ma'am. Your actions in Operation Grey Echo will never be forgotten. We still study your decisions at the War College." He turned to the audience before I could even process the words. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the interruption, but when a hero walks among us, even one dressed as a civilian, it deserves acknowledgement." And just like that, he walked back to the stage, leaving the room in stunned silence. Leaving me standing there, exposed, seen. The last time my family looked at me that way, I was 17, leaving home for the academy. But this time, it wasn't pride. It was confusion, dissonance, disbelief. My father stood up slowly, his mouth slightly open. "What was that?" "I think," my mother said faintly. The general saluted Lisa. She said my name like it was a foreign word in her mouth, like she hadn't used it in a long time. I sat down, my heart pounding. My father turned to me. "Operation—" "What?" I stayed quiet. Let the general's words hang in the air. Let them do the work I had spent years trying to avoid. "Lisa?" my mother said again, softer now. "What did he mean?" "He meant," I replied, keeping my eyes forward, "that the version of me you've been telling everyone about doesn't exist." The rest of the ceremony passed in a blur. Applause resumed, but it sounded distant. Ethan's name was called, and he walked across the stage, shaking hands with the same general who had just publicly resurrected the daughter no one in the Carter family talked about anymore. When Ethan looked into the crowd, his eyes locked on mine. Wide, disoriented. He gave a slight shake of his head, almost imperceptible, like trying to piece together a reality that didn't fit the story he knew. After the final anthem played and the ceremony was dismissed, families began rising, taking photos, handing out hugs. My parents didn't move. I could feel their stares. Eventually, my father broke the silence. "We're going to the reception tent. Ethan will want pictures with the family." I turned to him. "Would you like me in them this time?" He flinched. For a moment, the bravado cracked. I saw something in his face I hadn't seen since I was a teenager. Uncertainty. Maybe even shame. "I think we should talk," he muttered. I nodded once. "We should, but not in a tent full of people pretending this didn't just happen." I stepped away, my heels clicking against the tile floor, my pulse still a war drum in my chest. And behind me, I heard him whisper to my mother, "General?" Lisa was a general? To which my mother answered, "I don't think she's the disgrace anymore." I left the ceremony hall before the reception began. Not because I didn't want to celebrate Ethan, he'd earned his day, but because I knew what was coming next. Questions, assumptions, discomfort. And I didn't want to answer any of it under a plastic tent with strangers and lemonade. Instead, I walked toward the outer grounds of the base, where a quiet garden overlooked the training fields. It used to be my favorite spot when I trained here over a decade ago. Funny how life circles back. I hadn't been sitting there long when I heard footsteps behind me. I didn't turn around. "Lisa." It was my father's voice. Tight. Unreadable. He sounded like a man who'd just seen a ghost and wasn't sure if he wanted it to stay. I waited. He stepped beside the bench, standing stiffly like he didn't know whether to sit or salute. "You should have told us." My laugh came sharp and unexpected. "When? Before or after you called me an embarrassment in front of the family 2 Christmases ago?" "That's not fair." "No, Dad." I cut in, looking up at him now. "What's not fair is rewriting my entire life based on one incomplete rumor and never once asking me for the truth." He looked away, jaw clenched. "We thought you quit." "You thought I failed," I corrected. "And that story was easier for you than the truth." The silence between us was thick. Years of it, really. We'd had this conversation 100 times, just never out loud. "Why didn't you defend yourself?" he asked finally. "Why not tell us the truth?" "Because every time I tried to share even a small win, it got brushed aside," I said. "You all needed me to be the cautionary tale so Ethan could be the redemption story." He frowned. "That's not true." "Isn't it?" I asked quietly. "You told people I cracked under pressure, that I couldn't handle combat, that I walked away from duty, and you never once asked what really happened in Kandahar." His eyes darted toward me. "That's where it was? Kandahar?" I nodded once. "And the general mentioned Gray Echo?" I studied his face. The name clearly meant something to him. He was in command long enough to understand that kind of operation didn't get casually referenced. "What happened?" he asked, his voice lower now. I sighed, crossing my arms over my lap. "I can't give you everything. Much of it's still redacted. But here's what I can tell you. The mission went sideways. A civilian convoy entered the zone without clearance. My superior ordered us to stand down and wait for confirmation. I saw the IEDs being prepped on the ridge. I gave the order to redirect and engage." "You disobeyed command?" "I acted faster than the chain," I said. "And because of that, 3 families got their loved ones back alive." My father said nothing. "But the official report didn't like what it meant," I continued. "Too much gray area. My superior covered himself by pushing the failure downward. And I didn't have the right last name or the political capital to fight it." He looked shaken. "They discharged you." "Not dishonorably," I clarified, "but quietly. No ceremony, no recognition. Just a thick envelope and a whispered thanks." "And the general today?" "He was part of a separate investigation team, years later. He found my report, dug into the telemetry logs. Turns out my call was correct. So he tracked me down, privately, and asked me to consult on strategy. That was 5 years ago. My father sat heavily on the bench beside me, the weight of it all finally settling in. And you never said anything? What would have been the point? I asked. You'd already decided I was a disgrace, and the truth wouldn't have fit that narrative. He rubbed a hand over his face, his voice quiet. I'm sorry. It didn't fix anything. Not immediately, but it was the first honest sentence I'd heard from him in years. Why did you believe it so easily? I asked. That I failed? He looked down at his hands. Because I didn't understand how someone like you fit into this world, and I didn't try hard enough to find out. A long pause. Then I said, You were proud of Ethan today. Of course, he replied. You ever think I might have deserved that same pride once? His eyes met mine, and something cracked there. Something hard and old. Yes, he said, but I couldn't see it. Not until today. We sat in silence after that. No more words, just the heavy, complicated quiet between two people who finally started telling the truth. And behind us, I heard a second set of footsteps. Stephanie, my younger cousin, my father's golden child after Ethan, and the one who once told me at a family barbecue, Don't worry, Lisa, not everyone is meant to wear the uniform with honor. She looked at me now, a little pale, a little unsure. You're really a general? She asked. I met her eyes. I was. Now I lead strategic operations for civilian military response units. Stephanie blinked. Then, softly, almost reluctantly, I think I owe you an apology. Later that evening, I stood by the long banquet table in the reception tent, watching Ethan shake hands and pose for pictures. He was doing everything right. Confident, poised, proud. He looked good in the uniform. He always had. But my mind wasn't on him. It was still echoing with the words from earlier. I didn't understand how someone like you fit into this world. My father's words. Honest. Ugly. Long overdue. I sipped ginger ale from a plastic cup, still in the same civilian dress I'd worn that morning. I didn't need a uniform today. The damage had already been done. And undone. Across the room, I saw Stephanie with a few cousins, whispering, glancing in my direction. Not with malice, exactly. With uncertainty. Like they didn't know how to place me now that the narrative had cracked open. Let me explain something. For 10 years, my family told stories about me. At reunions, weddings, Sunday dinners. Little asides wrapped in fake concern. Carefully curated myths passed down until even they forgot what was true and what wasn't. Lisa couldn't handle pressure. She didn't last long. She had a breakdown during training. They offered her a desk job to save face. She won't talk about it because she's ashamed. But the truth? I didn't talk about it because they never asked. Not once. I had sat through years of those stories, smiling tightly, redirecting conversations, pretending not to hear the disappointment when someone said my name. Once, at my cousin Andrew's engagement party, my own aunt leaned over and whispered, Lisa, sweetie, you really should think about going back to school. It's not too late to have a second act. I remember looking at her, realizing she had no idea that same month I had been coordinating a joint force response unit that evacuated 312 civilians from a compromised zone under threat of missile fire. Second act? I was already writing my third. Still, I had smiled and thanked her. Because what else could I do? This family had decided what my story was. And anything that didn't fit, they simply erased. Ethan eventually wandered over, looking as polished and controlled as ever. You're causing quite the stir, he said, picking at a cracker from the table. Wasn't my intention. I know, he said, watching me closely. But why didn't you tell me either? That stung. Because you were the one they were proud of, I replied. I didn't want to take that from you. Ethan's jaw tensed. Lisa, come on, that's not fair. Isn't it? I asked softly. He sighed. You could have told me you were a general. I wouldn't have cared. You would have, I said. You just don't know it, because we were raised to believe success had only one face, and it wasn't mine. He didn't argue. Instead, he looked down and said, I'm sorry. I blinked. Not just for today, he added, for everything, for listening to their version, for not asking more. That moment, just that small sliver of vulnerability, was more than I had ever expected from him, and it unraveled something I didn't even realize I'd been holding on to. Thanks, I said. That means something. Then he hesitated. So, what do we do now? I looked around the room, at our relatives, at our father standing stiffly near the dessert table, pretending not to glance at me every 30 seconds, at our mother laughing too loudly with family friends to fill the cracks in the day. I turned back to Ethan. Now, I said. Now, we let them sit with the truth for a while. He nodded, then smiled slightly. You know what the general said to me backstage? What? He said, I had no idea that Carter's sister was the Lisa Carter. You've got a lot to live up to. I laughed then. Really laughed. And Ethan did too. It was the first real laugh we'd shared in years. Maybe ever. As the night went on, people began to approach me. A second cousin here, an old neighbor there. Little comments, awkward compliments. And through it all, I said as little as possible. Not to be rude, but because it wasn't my job to correct them anymore. I had spent years trying to shrink myself to fit into their version of me. I wasn't going to do that again. If they wanted to understand who I really was, they would have to come find me in the full truth of who I'd become. And for the first time in a long, long time, I was okay with that. The next morning, my phone buzzed just after 7 a.m. Dad. I stared at the screen for a long second, thumb hovering. He never called me this early, or at all. After a beat, I answered. Hi. His voice was rough with sleep and something else. Hesitation. Can you come by the house before you head back? Now? I think we should talk. I agreed, cautiously. Something in his voice wasn't hard like usual. It was brittle. When I arrived, the house looked exactly the same as it had for the past 20 years. The same eagle statue on the porch. The faded American flag above the garage. But something felt different, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. He met me at the door. For a moment, we both just stood there. Then he stepped aside. Come in. Inside, my mother was already seated in the living room, tea in hand. Stephanie was beside her, unusually quiet. Ethan stood near the fireplace, hands in his pockets, eyes flicking between all of us. I sat across from them and waited. My father cleared his throat. Last night, I did a lot of thinking. I raised an eyebrow. That's a first. He gave a faint smile. Tight, but genuine. I deserved that. He sat down slowly, then looked at me. I realized something. Somewhere along the way, we stopped seeing you. Not just who you became, but who you always were. Silence. I didn't know how to raise a daughter like you. He continued. You didn't want what we expected. You didn't follow the script. I wasn't supposed to, I said quietly. I wasn't written into it. He nodded, exhaling. I think we convinced ourselves you had failed because the alternative, admitting we never really knew you, was harder to face. My mother spoke next. Her voice was softer, trembling around the edges. I remember the day your academy letter came, she said. You were so excited. I told myself I was worried for you. But the truth was, I didn't understand how to support a daughter whose dreams scared me. I didn't know what to say to that. Not yet. Stephanie leaned forward, elbows on her knees. I should have asked more. I should have listened. I thought if you weren't telling us about your work, it meant you didn't have anything to share. I never imagined it was the opposite. My jaw tightened. You didn't want to imagine it, I said. Because then you'd have to confront the way you talked about me all those years. That hung in the room. I hadn't planned to say it. But it was true. My father swallowed. We owe you an apology. You do, I replied. But I'm not here just for an apology. He looked up, confused. Then what do you want? I want you to stop rewriting my story to make yourselves more comfortable, I said. You don't get to tell people I had a rough patch or that I left the military early because it wasn't for me. That's not what happened. And pretending it is? That's another betrayal. My mother flinched. Stephanie looked down. I don't need a family that pities me, I continued. I need a family that respects me. Ethan nodded quietly. We can do that. My father was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, What would you like us to tell people? I leaned forward. Tell them your daughter is a decorated former captain who led classified operations that saved lives. Tell them she now leads strategic civilian military response units across multiple regions. Tell them she stayed silent all these years, not because she failed, but because you weren't ready to hear the truth. He sat back, visibly shaken, but he nodded. My mother looked at me through tear-glossed eyes. Lisa, will you let us try again? I looked around the room at all of them, so eager now to undo the damage, to turn a page. Trying mattered, but it wasn't a switch they could flip. I'll let you try, I said. But understand, trust isn't something I owe you just because we share a name. It's something you'll have to earn. No one spoke for a moment. Then my father stood and crossed the room. For the first time in my adult life, he looked at me like an equal, and with quiet humility, he said, We'll earn it. 6 months passed. Life moved on. But the silence between me and my family, once heavy and suffocating, had begun to loosen. It didn't dissolve overnight. Healing never does. But the cracks started to fill in with something I hadn't expected from them in years. Effort. Real effort. My mother started calling every Sunday, not to check in with pity, but to ask thoughtful questions about my work, my team, my life. She even looked up a few acronyms so she could keep up. Ethan invited me to speak at a leadership seminar at his base. Said he wanted his fellow officers to hear from someone with actual field brilliance. That made me laugh. And my father, well, he was the slowest to shift, as I knew he would be. But even he changed. One day, a formal-looking envelope arrived in the mail. Inside was a handwritten letter. Neat, straight, military style. It read, Lisa, when I wore the uniform, I used to think honor was about obedience, discipline, reputation. But now I see it's also about truth. About standing tall even when the people who should support you don't. You've done that. I'm proud of you. Truly. Dad, I read it 3 times. And for the first time in 2 decades, I cried. Not because I needed his validation. By now, I had long since learned to live without it. But because for once it was offered freely. No strings. No conditions. Just truth. It was the final confirmation I didn't even realize I'd been waiting for. Then came the next invitation. Ethan was being honored again. A promotion ceremony this time. But this one was different. This time, he asked me to pin his new rank. You were the first person who made me want to lead, he said when he called. Even when I didn't understand it. The ceremony was smaller, less fanfare. But the moment I stepped onto that stage to pin my brother's insignia, the silence in the room told me everything. They saw me now, not as a shadow, not as a secret, but as someone who belonged. Afterward, as we stood in line for coffee in the base canteen, a young cadet approached me. Nervous, barely out of school. Excuse me, ma'am. General Carter, right? I smiled. Not anymore. I stepped back from that post. But yes, I'm Lisa. He looked relieved. We studied your case in command ethics. Gray Echo. I just wanted to say, thank you. That decision saved lives. For a moment, I was 27 again, standing in a cold, sand-covered command tent with a radio in one hand and the weight of human lives in the other. I had made the right call, even when no one saw it at the time. "Thank you," I told him. "That means more than you know." He saluted, and this time I returned it without hesitation. As I turned back toward the table, I noticed my father watching from across the room. He saw the exchange. He saw the salute. And this time, he smiled. Not a forced, performative smile, but the kind you give when you're proud of someone you never quite understood, until you finally did. This, I thought, was what truth does. It endures, even when buried beneath decades of denial. Later that evening, our family gathered in a small restaurant near the base. Nothing fancy, just good food, warm light, and laughter that wasn't forced. At one point, Stephanie raised a toast. "To Lisa," she said, her glass lifted. "Who proved that sometimes the strongest voice is the one that doesn't need to shout?" Everyone raised their glasses, and I felt it. Not just the recognition, but the peace. The quiet kind. The kind that comes not from winning a battle, but from refusing to surrender who you are, even when everyone around you tries to rewrite your story. You asked what happened when the general walked over and saluted me at my brother's graduation? That was the moment everything shifted. The moment silence broke. The moment the story they had written about me was ripped wide open and replaced with the truth. And not just for them, but for me. Because while they had spent years telling everyone I was a disgrace, I had spent years becoming someone I could be proud of, even if no one else ever noticed. Turns out that was enough all along. And maybe, just maybe, that's what honor really means.